Hey everybody, this is Mr. Wolf. We're back with another lesson video studying up for that state test. I want to remind you guys that we're going to be doing as much review and as much work to prepare for the state test as we can. So I don't want you guys to get stressed out. Don't want you guys to worry. You just put your full effort in. You do as much as you can, and you'll be fine. I can guarantee that. So today we're looking at distance and midpoint formula, and we're going to touch on the equation of a circle at the end. The good thing about this is we're just looking at formulas and how to use them. You're not necessarily needed to learn a bunch of vocabulary words or anything. So we're just touching on some stuff. Let's start off with the distance formula. So the distance formula gives you how far 2 points are from one another. So if I gave you a line segment like this, and of course this would be on some sort of XY axis like this, the distance formula is going to help you learn how long this line is. And it looks intimidating, but I think once you guys commit it to memory or get some practice with it, you'll be fine. So the distance formula uses a few different things. D is our distance. X1, Y1 is our 0.1, so we'll just say P1 for 0.1. And X2, Y2 is our 0.2. So if we had a graph, well, I erased that line before because we could have used it. We can have 2 points, and we'll say, well, this is P1, and this is P2, where the coordinates are X2, Y2 on P2, and X1, Y1 on P1. So what is the distance formula? The distance formula is D, our distance, is equal to square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. Make sure that's all under your square root sign. So that looks pretty big and intimidating, but let's do some examples of this, and I can promise you it's not as scary as it seems. So let's go on to distance formula examples. We'll do one example. We have 0.1 equals 4.5, and P2 equals 12.10. One thing I like to do is kind of write out to the side what our x1s and y1s are and our x2s and y2s. So we can say x1 is going to be equal to 4, x2 will be equal to 12, y1 will be equal to 5, and y2 will be equal to 10. So you can label those out, and that'll help you plug everything you need to know into this formula. So we say that D is equal to the square root of our x2, which in this case is 12, minus our x1, which is 4, squared, plus our y2, which is 10, minus our y1, which is 5, squared. And then we just start simplifying this. One thing we can do is we can say, well, D equals the square root of 12 minus 4, that's just 8. So we have 8 squared, plus 10 minus 5, that is 5. So we have 5 squared. Then we'll square those out. We'll say D is equal to the square root of 8 squared, which is 64, plus 5 squared, which is 25. Now we just have basic addition here. D is equal to the square root of 64 plus 25, which is 89. And now you're at your answer. Now, this comes out to a decimal of some sort. And I want to say on the state test, they're going to give you options for this answer. This is where, if I were testing you over this, I would let you stop here. At the square root of 89, that's fine. You can stop there. But there is a chance that this will come out to a decimal or some sort of other answer. Whatever the answers are, there's a couple tricks I like to do here, especially working with square roots, is if there are decimals as answers, put this in the calculator and see what it comes out to. Let me do that real quick for you guys. I couldn't tell you what the decimal is off the top of my head, so give me one moment, and we'll figure out what exactly we're looking at as far as Here we go, the square root. Apologies for the delay, 1 second. So it's going to be roughly 9.434. So put that in the calculator and you'll get that number. Now, occasionally, you may have some other answers that don't necessarily match up. There may be weird fractions, whatever it is. One thing I like to do is if the answer I have and the answer problems don't match up, is put them all in the calculator and see if the decimals match. But I think in this case, you'll either run into your answer as square root of 89 or this decimal we have here. Let's do another example real quick before we move on to midpoint formula. Let's say our point 1 is equal to 5, 9, and our point 2 is equal to -7, -7. So let's label our x1s and y1s. X1 is going to be equal to 5, y1 is going to be equal to 9, x2 is going to be equal to -7, and y2 is also going to be equal to -7. We touched on this last time. I do want to emphasize, if you're working with points, your x always comes first, your y comes second. So x on the left, y on the right. So let's plug this in and see what we get. Our distance is going to be equal to the square root of x2, which is -7, minus x1, which is 5, squared, plus y2, which is -7, minus y1, which is 9, squared. So let's combine terms and see what we get. So we have -7 minus 5. That's going to get us -12. Make sure you put that square on there because we still haven't squared it out. Then we have -7 minus 9, which is going to give us -16 squared. So let's square these things out. D is going to be equal to -12 squared, which in this case would be 144, because when you square a negative, you're multiplying two negatives together, so they cancel out. You're left with 144. Same thing with this -16. We square the -16, it becomes a positive 256. Then we just add those together. D is equal to the square root of 400. And this ends up being 20. So I do want to emphasize on the state test, they're going to give you a variety of answers. Sometimes they may be the simplest form. So it may come down to your answer being 20. But also, your answer may be the square root of 400. So it's always good to do as much work as you can and then look back through the steps to see what matches. This all comes down to looking at the question, reading it fully, and reading all your answer choices and considering them equally until you can narrow down to which one you decide is the final answer. So be careful when reading those questions, guys. Let's move on to midpoint formula. This one I believe is a little bit easier to remember. At least it always was for me. I'm not quite sure. So midpoint formula gives you the midpoint of a line segment. So just like in the last one, you're going to have a set of axes and some sort of line where there are 2 points. We'll say this is P1 and this is P2. And what the midpoint formula will give you is that midpoint. Let's say the midpoint lies somewhere right here. This will be your M. So M is going to equal our midpoint. And we have P1 and P2, which are our points, with x1, y1 as point 1, and x2, y2 as point 2, just like we did with the other formula. The only real difference in this is that we use an M for midpoint instead of a D for distance. And of course, we're not getting the length of the line, we are getting the midpoint of that line. So your answer is actually going to be an XY coordinate. So let's see what the midpoint formula is. We say M is equal to x1 plus x2 divided by 2, or over 2, comma, this is our coordinate. So this is our first coordinate. This will be our x. And then the second coordinate is y1 plus y2 divided by 2 as our second coordinate. This is our y. So you do these two things almost separately of each other. In the last one, we added two separate things together and then got the square root. In this case, you just have two separate entities that you're working towards. And really what this is x1 plus x2 divided by 2. You're just getting the average of those x coordinates. That's all you're really doing here. So let's do some examples of this. Let's write it down again just so we have it at the top of our paper. And when you guys are doing this work, and I would recommend this for the state test too, when it comes down to a formula you know, write it down at the top of the page, or write it down on your scratch paper, whatever it is, so that you don't have to think about it. And if for some reason you can't think about something on the moment, you got it there to reference. Also, the more you write it down, the more you'll commit it to memory. So definitely write this down as much as you can. So let's write this again. We have x1 plus x2 divided by 2 is our first coordinate, and y1 plus y2 divided by 2 as our second coordinate. So let's do an example. Let's say we have P1 is equal to 4, 5. P2 is equal to 12, 10. Same points we did with the first example on distance formula. So let's label out our x's. x1 equals 4. x2 equals 12. Oops. y1 is equal to 5. And y2 is equal to 10. So now we just plug in what we have. We would have our midpoint is equal to x1 plus x2. So 4 plus 12 divided by 2 is our first coordinate. And our second one would be 5 plus 10, our y1 plus y2, divided by 2 as our second coordinate. So we can simplify these. We say m equals 4 plus 12, which is 16, divided by 2. And our second coordinate, 5 plus 10, is 15, divided by 2. And then we can simplify these further and saying 16 divided by 2 is 8, and 15 divided by 2, 7.5. So in this case, we've been talking about the state test giving you different answers. Some possible answers you may have in this case is 8 and 15 over 2. So this step here, and this step here all equal the same thing. So one of these very well could be your answer. I'd say these are probably the most three. I'll tell you one thing they will do too. This is a wrong choice. So wrong. They may give you this. 15 over 2, 8. Or 7.5, 8. And that comes back to just knowing that coordinates are x on the left and y on the right. So be careful, once again, in doing these examples so you don't get tripped up along the way. Let's do another example. Let's say we have point 1 at 5, 9, and point 2 at -7, -7. Once again, we did the same example with distance formula. I use these same points for a reason so you can see how they differ. So let's label. We have x1 is equal to 5, x2 is equal to -7, y1 is equal to 9, and y2 is equal to -7. Let's plug it in our formula. M is going to be equal to 5 plus -7 divided by 2 as our first coordinate, and 9 plus -7 divided by 2 as our second coordinate. So we can say m is going to be equal to, well, 5 plus a -7 is the same as 5 minus 7, so we have -2 over 2 as our first coordinate, and 9 plus a -7 leaves us with just 2 over 2 as our second. So we simplify these. -2 divided by 2 is just going to be -1, and 2 divided by 2 is just going to be 1. So that's what we end up with. Remember, when we're working with midpoint formula, guys, you're going to end up with a coordinate as your answer. Distance, you're going to have a number. With midpoint, you have a point. Think about it that way. The distance, if I ask you of the distance between point A and point B, you're going to give me a single number. But if I ask you for the midpoint between point A and point B, you'll have to give me two numbers, some kind of coordinate to get me there. So think about what they are and what your answer will be. Midpoint formula needs a point. Distance is just a number. Now we're on to the equation of a circle. Let's do, well, first I got to show you exactly what this is. Though you'll use a couple things here, and some of this information should be ready, kind of fresh in your mind as far as circles go, because we just finished up circles. So with the equation of a circle, you're going to use r, which is equal to your radius. And remember, guys, the radius is that line that looks like this, from the center point to any point on the circle. And then we'll also be working with our center point, which is that point exactly in the middle. And we will use the coordinates h, k for that center point. So those will what we'll be using to label the coordinates in this case. So let's do an example. I guess before we do an example, I should give you the actual equation. I got a little bit ahead of myself there. The equation of the circle is as follows. You'll have a point x, which will stay as that x, minus our h, which is one of the coordinates here in our center point, and that will be squared, plus a y point, which will stay as a y, minus our k, the second point there in our center point coordinate, and that will also be squared. And that is going to be equal to the radius squared. So we have hk as our center point, and we subtract each of those coordinates from an x and a y in parentheses, squaring them, and set it equal to our radius squared. Now we can finally do an example. Once again, write this stuff down. It helps to write it down. I promise you it sounds crazy when you can just look at your screen and see the equation here, but it helps so much to write this down on your paper. I'm not misleading you there. So let's write it down here and do an example. We're going to have a center point, which we'll call center PT to abbreviate, and we're going to have a radius. So in this case, I'm going to give you the center point and the radius, and you will have to write the equation for the circle. So if I said your center point happens at 4, 3, and you have a radius of 8, you must write out the formula. So let's just plug this stuff in. Remember, the center point, that's our h and that's our k. Our x value on the center point is h, and our y value on the center point is k. So we just plug those in. We say x minus our h, which is 4, squared, plus y minus our k, which is 3, squared, is going to be equal to our radius squared. Our radius is 8. So that's not bad. You just write that out. Let's do another example. Something a little bit different here. Let's say I give you a center point of 8, 3. And I give you instead of a radius, I will give you a diameter of, we'll say 8. And I want you to write that equation. So let's continue this. We have our x minus our h value, which in this case is 8, squared, plus y minus our k value, which in this case is 3, squared, and that equals our radius squared. But we got to be careful. We don't have the radius. We have the diameter. And if you guys remember, our diameter is equal to 2 times our radius. So if we want to get the radius here, we have to divide what we have here by 2. So if our diameter equals 8, our radius will equal 8 divided by 2, which is just equal to 4. So our radius squared would be 4 squared, not 8. Make sure you read what you have, because they will do things like that on the test to confuse you. Now, let's do something a little bit different. Another one. I'm going to give you the equation of the circle, and I want you to tell me the center point and the radius. So if I give you something like this, x minus 12 squared plus y minus 7 squared equals 81. We want to get our center point, and we want to get our radius. So if we remember, our center point coordinates are those here and here. They're just subtracted from our x and our y values. So our center point in this case, our h value would be 12, and our k value would be 7. So we have our center point. Now we want our radius. Remember, this value on the other side of the equal sign is our radius squared. So this 81 is our radius squared. So r squared equals 81. And we want to get this to where we just have r. We want to get that square off there. So to cancel out that square, we'd take the square root of both sides. So we have r squared equals the square root of 81. And in this case, that would get us r equals 9, because 9 squared is equal to 81. So r equals 9. And this would be our answer. You may run into an instance to where instead of it wanting the center point and the radius, it may say, well, what's the diameter? You're given this information up here, and it wants to know the diameter of the circle. In that case, there's an extra step involved. You know that this value in the end is going to be equal to your radius squared, so you'd get the square root of that to find your radius, but remember, your diameter is equal to your radius times 2. So we'd take our radius that we've already got as 9, and we could say that the diameter is equal to 18. Guys, that's all I have for you here. This is a lot of information, so go back through the video if you need, pause it where you deem necessary, take notes, all of that good stuff. There is a worksheet to go along with this that has a lot of really good examples. That worksheet will be due Monday at midnight, so make sure you get it done. Thank you guys for watching this far in the video, and I hope you guys are taking your study for this state test seriously. If you guys need anything, feel free to reach out to me or Mr. Rose. We are as readily available as we can be. So if you need anything, let us know.